Hello all, and this video is going to be our parting with John Dewey with looking at reconstructive philosophy, his little book on Reconstruction. I wanted to do an in-depth video on this because I think it's rather important for remember that American way of thinking that we've been tracing through the pragmatists now. But reconstructive philosophy is one of Dewey's projects where he goes through classic thought, classic abstraction, and draws different distinctions and polarities that he has problems with. And so one of the first distinctions you'll see is the unchanging qualitative entity that's basic for everything, and sort of static representation for how philosophies modeled the world with in relation to the atom. And so it's kind of difficult. Dewey's trying to ask, well, how can we go from this way of looking at being or a static representation of it towards one that's set towards growth and process and the interrelations of those models that we mentioned earlier, instead of that old empirical tradition. So humans are a process and not just this atomistic substance. And so that is really where you want to start with how Dewey's going to go about experience or human experience as a whole. It's empirically presented experience as such with memory. Experience gives us identity to be conscious of, and that through that lens is where everything, of course, is understood. And so for Dewey, trying to understand concrete experience is understanding that human experience itself makes us creatures of desire and not of abstract thinking. And so the attitudes of human nature, this is that, of course, that functional psychology that we've been talking about. This understood standard, unified way of seeing human experience is really paramount for his project, because you want to have that common denominator in order to model out from that. And so psychology and the relations between Darwinist evolutionary processes and us as humans is, of course, something of interest for a naturalist philosopher such as Dewey. Thought, then, for Dewey himself is a function, is a biological function, and it's an organism that's responding to the experience of his own relation around him. And so, old philosophy, if you will, is consolidated as these passed on theoreticals. He's very interested in old philosophy and past abstractions that look to retain past ideals, pass them down, but the past isn't always necessarily the answer for the present, especially if there's situations that haven't been processed before. And so Dewey, has a problem with, this fixed doctrine of the past, um, as compared to something that is more situational and looks to answer actual particular questions being asked in the present experience, as opposed to the past. And so, just as an aside here for my own commentary, I did want to go back to, that goal of ordinary experience, because of course we've talked about this on the channel with regards to, political ambitions as a sort of, margin of the outside and their representations and preserving their rights, as opposed to putting it towards ordinary experience. And of course I would say that if you have a sturdy ordinary experience, and that actually would create an even stronger polarity among the other or the outside, as it were. But I think trying to capture ordinary experience is you can kind of see, if you will, the influence really of just the American psyche here with politically, you could say Dewey really just thinks of instrumentation of values meant for solving situations. So his politics, or the political for him, is really based off of solving situations with instrumentation towards ordinary experience. But if you look at something like the acceleration movement with Nick Land in recent years, although it's tapered quite a bit, what really was the essence of accelerationism, but artificially bringing about problem situations that can shake up the structure. You can see that even here with someone like Dewey, where change in the political would need to complement or even change ordinary experience of a population through problem situations. And so that's always interesting to see when we talk of political thinkers and how they could be trying to formulate a way to not just handle problem situations, but even create them for their own power. That's a theme that I think I wanted to hit home in this video for Reconstruction philosophy and his problem situations. And so, if that was just the beginning of Reconstructive philosophy, with his comparisons of the old and the new way of doing philosophy or science going forward, each chapter is captures that essence that we'll go through with chapter 2 really being about abstract principles as a whole, with the distinction, of course, with Aristotle and Francis Bacon. Because, of course, knowledge is power, as Bacon referred to. But, of course, what he meant by that is, if you have, knowledge should be about ways in which we could, actually have causality, have those problem situations in that political sense, go in the favor, or to actually help cause these situations, whereas knowledge in the Aristotelian sense, of course, is more settled with encompassing truth and form of human knowledge of all time, but it's not really about holding on to causal processes or having a hand in them. It's in these principles and in discussions of the good and ethics. So old philosophy is after logical syllogism, proof, evidentialist ideas, while new philosophy, or at least the synthesis of it, Dewey is kind of an American Hegelian, so that might be interesting to also put in that he's not just saying that all old philosophy is just the past is the past and there's nothing that you can learn from it. Of course not, but that's just one component of it. Whereas reconstructing this new philosophy is after discovery, in that Baconian tradition of using the utility of knowledge to change causal mechanisms. And so if you use this new philosophy, then you can use knowledge of causality towards solving political problems and to solve conflicts in the world. And Dewey here is writing this on the cusp of one world war, but another one right around the corner. And of course, one of the biggest concerns was how to avoid a second world war, which of course in hindsight is vain. And but when you look at philosophy, when you look at that a couple decades there was a time period where thought revolved around using ethics and politics and on a situational basis for avoiding conflict. And so will have large implications here, because of course the social sciences and instrumentalist ethic has ramifications of being filled to the brim in the departments with this kind of thinking of situational ethics. And maybe perhaps one of the reasons, in addition to American philosophy largely being cast away as inferior to the continent, or even the past as a whole. And so you could see in this video series on Dewey, it's not performing as well as someone like Hegel or Kant, of course, as you might expect. No hard feelings there for me, but I do think that a lot of philosophy can be discarded simply because these concepts that Dewey are talking about are just so influential that you just take them for granted in a way, insofar that having them pointed out to you really it's not very novel in that sort of sense. Whereas there's other philosophers and other ideologies that failed, or whatever the case may be, that seem far more interesting than having a philosopher describe the water that you're swimming in. But and so you can see that that sort of ethics would have huge ramifications for the social sciences going forward after Dewey. And so in chapter 3, when he wants to talk about natural science, he is asserting that there actually is no fixed value or fixed ends in nature in itself, but values, ethics, these sort of things are creative aspects from as Kant would say in the Copernican revolution. These are subjective in our own creation. Nature doesn't correspond to these values where we give it the world value. So Dewey has a universe that's free of value, and it's interesting to see how he goes about that towards instrumentation of the scientific method as compared to how other people, like Sartre, for example, will answer that question. And so his repudiation there in chapter 3 of fixed ends is rather important. And then when you go to chapter 4, which of course is another, one of the main ideas with human experience in history, changes in how we live, and psychology based off of those changes in biology as creatures of desire, as we've mentioned. It's that continuum and interaction that past empirical modeling or philosophers with people like Locke, they tried to quantify it as these static separatist ways, as Whitehead would have said, but there's a prehensiveness to this. There's an interactiveness towards these externals. It's not just you out there and then interacting with the externals. The externals help shape how you will be able to perceive, and that's what he's using with biology as a whole, and that relationship. It's not passive. It's within that structured environment instead of the atom. But as you go to chapter 5, is his take on Plato and the ideal. There is no ideals out there. There is just simply resolutions to the problems. Ideals don't exist in a separate realm or something like that, but it is the ideal is the satisfaction of problem situations resolving. As for chapter 6, which is based off of logic, he wants to talk about formal logic and deduction as experienced versus the experiential or scientific method that requires actually having concrete action that we can observe in its practicality. Skepticism and checking what is sufficient enough isn't interesting to Dewey. Neither is these questions about what is the good. We can't describe that without coming to an agreement on what these abstractions actually are. Dewey's not interested in that. He's about the practicality of it, the practicality that will change human experience and thought as a whole. And so real quickly, I just wanted to get through 4, 5, and 6, and then you get to chapter 7, which is the moral reconstruction, which is built knowledge based, of course, on past empirical generalizations. Develops these moral rules, but it draws too much from the past. Another interesting aside here, while Dewey is going about it in a different way, you can perhaps see elements of that time period with regards to futurism and certainly with fascism, with Italy and whatnot. But here with America, Dewey is very focused, of course, on the future too. He wants to have his epistemology be more future orientated instead of using someone else's past experiences. We should look towards the future and being able to form hypothesis and the modeling and instrumentation of these things, but using it as a suggested from the funded experience, to deduce hypothesis for the future. But I also wanted to brush up on a couple other themes for Dewey that I think every philosopher gets kind of probed for on their thoughts on these kind of things. So I thought his conception of evil is something to consider as well. Evil is a practicality. It's not these abstract judgments of what is good and evil, but it's not theoretical debates, but it's situational. Nature isn't value ridden, but we supplant our values onto it, which as mentioned with Sartre earlier when we were talking about his summation of what it means to just have human ideals projected out onto the universe. For Sartre, he says, if God is dead, then of course anything is possible. So if we, break free, liberation, if you will, will become very important going forward. But that liberation of having anything possible, if there's actually no order within nature, then everything that we create is on the table. And you can see at least here, or certainly with Sartre, as we'll get into, there is that sort of romance of the scientific method actually or just the secular project going forward, post-religious, and that kind of post-Christian way, if you will. You can see that there is that sort of optimism there that you can't lose, even though it's since shifted, I would say. But ideas, though, there is this interesting way of conceiving ideas also with a lot of these pragmatists. Thoughts. They're sort of like a web of these different ideas, and if you're an American too, in my age group, using those word webs, this kind of has a similar way with how it's not just this linear inference like past philosophical schools of thought or ways of thinking about it, but belief arises out of us in different schemes, different things that we are considering at the time. It's much more in a sort of multiplicity than it is just in representation of just one idea, following through as a model. It's much more interwoven in psychology and things like that. And if we're going to wrap it up here, I suppose I wanted to really get at the influence that Dewey obviously had just on American culture, even to this day, insofar that you can kind of see that Dewey doesn't think of the past should just be recognized simply for being the past or just having past knowledge, but that we should actually use these things in an instrumentation. Also, an aside here that might be interesting to do for fun is that Dewey, you could say that he's just talking about utilitarian ethics, but Dewey actually would say that utilitarianism is that old philosophy, that old a set way of thinking about the greater good for a people, where of course Dewey is much more interactive. It can change, and so Dewey wants to point towards the actual instrumentation as opposed to just utilitarian ethics. But I also think though that if you see that sort of antagonism in Reconstruction philosophy here with Dewey, that speaks volumes for the differences, I think, between the Anglosphere and American culture, where there really isn't that long-standing American intellectual tradition. Certainly, these John Dewey videos would be more popular then. So you can kind of see even then that in the American culture we largely want to stick with what handles problems as they arise. It's not really an affinity or romance for who you even are as a people or being, but it's based off of just the handling of problem situations. Because of course if biology is in that reciprocal of social situations, and survival of course is paramount, and so survival would have to be at the forefront of your ethics, even though I think other people would say that that's not necessarily the case. But for Dewey, he wants that education that is adjustable to its surroundings, just as we are adjustable to the surroundings on an evolutionary basis. Just like the American psyche, and in a cynical way, how it kind of sheds and seems to move in these dialectics in a fast way. I think you can kind of see that here with changing towards problem situations as they arise. It doesn't really leave that sort of loyalty towards past ancestry, or with something like mestizo culture or something like that, where or past civilizations with the Chinese, or something like that, where the dead, and asking the traditions what to do. The traditions usually will tell you, of course, not to, which is typical, of course, for traditions that are trying to survive and pass down through the generations. There's that kind of minutia towards wanting to change for its own sake, and so Dewey is trying to move away from that and reconstruct it in a different way. But if we're going to critique Dewey here, we would say yes, John Dewey is critiquing ethics and abstractions and rules that were to come from past experience, but problem situations and how he defines them is of course in a way a fixed doctrine of abstract principles themselves. And his principles of not sticking to principles is something that you always have to consider, that when you are taking in philosophy that is in that dichotomy of trying to be more concrete than abstraction, and in critiques of someone being more abstract, but they themselves, of course, are being abstract. So there's that shortcoming in that argument there. And you can see, of course, as we always watch with the disciplines, morphing, and you can see the parting of really in Dewey, especially with, even though he uses it and respects it, but psychology and philosophy are becoming separate entities, especially in academic professions. And so you can perhaps look at that, as well as how you see philosophers in that understanding, since the Copernican, of the subjectiveness of values, then they would just simply become instrumentalist academics towards problem situations. And I think that, again, it just speaks volumes to the influence of academia as a whole in the last century. But this is just my final roundup of John Dewey and Reconstructive philosophy and pragmatism, and its influence on America and the world, really. The book itself reads rather easily if you are used to that way that concepts just aren't laid out in a linear inference, but it's more about fleshing them out on top of each other, and not in that sort of linear line, but in that web of ideas, quite literally, and how it's written in that style. But it's very easy to get through. Certainly not has a lot of technical terminology like someone like Kant or something like that. It's a lot easier to read than most of the thinkers we've been doing on the channel since the medievals, I would say, actually. Thanks for watching, guys, and make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and follow me on Twitter at Bongo Bongerson. Thanks.